I was stuck at the office late last Tuesday with a colleague, one of those guys who has made being busy his entire personality. He sat there, eyes bloodshot, staring at a spreadsheet, telling me for the 100th time how much he hates the corporate rat race. He kept fantasizing about his upcoming vacation, painting this vivid picture of a cabin in the woods, total silence, absolutely no Wi-Fi. I just need to unplug, he said. I'm doing this for my sanity. To hear him tell it, his labor was just a painful means to a peaceful end. But then the project actually finished early. The manager walked in and told everyone to go home, log off, and take a long weekend. And that's when I saw it, a literal glitch in the matrix. Instead of relief, this look of genuine panic washed over his face. He didn't pack up, he actually stayed behind, inventing new, completely unnecessary formatting issues to fix. He spent another 2 hours aggressively stressing over a problem that no longer existed. It was bizarre. It became obvious that he didn't actually want the cabin or the peace. He was getting some strange, twisted kick out of the exhaustion itself. The burnout wasn't the cost of his ambition, it was the product. He was secretly enjoying his own misery. That moment, watching him furiously type away to avoid his own freedom, forces us to ask a terrifying question. What if we don't actually want the things we say we want? What if the frustration, the obstacle, and the struggle aren't things blocking our happiness, but are actually the only things fueling it?
That's a powerful story. And that collie's behavior, that almost perverse reaction.
Yeah, it was genuinely strange to watch.
It perfectly encapsulates the core pathology we're going to deep dive into today, drawn from the work of the philosopher Slavoj Žižek.
Okay.
That moment where he actively resists peace to cling to stress, that is what Žižek calls the inverted world at work. And it's really the key to understanding a lot of modern ideological traps.
The inverted world. It sounds, I don't know, almost like something from a classic sci-fi novel, a place where everything you try to achieve just turns into its exact opposite.
In many ways, it behaves exactly like that, like a self-subverting sci-fi reality. Our mission for this deep dive is to explore how we, all of us, actively participate in systems we claim to hate.
Driven by what, though?
Driven by a hidden engine of satisfaction. We're trying to move beyond just the surface-level politics and economics that define our public conversations.
Right, the usual talking points.
Exactly. We want to investigate the underlying psychological dynamics that sustain what just looks like pure irrationality in modern life. And our key tool for this, that hidden engine, is the concept of surplus enjoyment.
Surplus enjoyment.
Or, as Žižek calls it, using the Lacanian term, jouissance.
Okay, jouissance.
And we're going to trace how this perverse satisfaction fuels really everything from ideological fragmentation to the perpetual anxiety that just seems to define contemporary society. It's a structural explanation for why rational people keep making irrational choices.
All right, let's unpack that core idea first then, this paradox of the inverted world. When you say Žižek is drawing from Hegel here, you're suggesting there's some kind of fundamental structural flaw in reality itself, that our rational actions keep leading to irrational outcomes.
That's it, precisely. And it's not just about simple irony, oh, that didn't go as planned.
Yeah.
It's about a deep, structural, almost predictable self-subversion.
So can you give us some examples, some historical context for this inversion?
Certainly. If you just look at large-scale historical efforts, projects designed to maximize human flourishing, this pattern of inversion emerges again and again, almost relentlessly.
Like what?
Take the Great Revolutions, for example. They all begin with this rational, beautiful dream of absolute freedom, universal fraternity, equality.
The highest ideals.
The highest. Yet over and over, where do they end up? They culminate in the reign of terror, in mass purges, in the establishment of a new and often more brittle totalitarian order. The path to maximum freedom somehow leads directly to maximum oppression.
And we see this mirrored today, right? Even in our technological advances, the internet, social media, they were designed to connect us, to democratize information.
They were supposed to make us more efficient, more collaborative on a global scale.
Exactly. The rational path should have led to some kind of global enlightenment and connection.
But what did we get instead? Instead, technology delivers fragmentation, it delivers unprecedented political polarization, chronic isolation.
And this massive anxiety-producing surveillance machine.
A machine of surveillance capital. It's the same pattern. We launched these grand economic plans aimed at creating universal wealth, maximizing global productivity, and somehow the result is widening inequality and a deepening, almost painful moral poverty for millions. even in the wealthiest nations.
So the machine is working, it's producing, but the output is fundamentally corrupted. It's inverted.
It sounds like the world is running on a sort of flipped instruction manual where the most logical path leads to a completely irrational destination. But the key thing you emphasized is that this instability isn't just random chaos. It's a sustained condition.
It's not random at all. It follows a strange, hidden logic that guarantees instability without guaranteeing collapse.
What do you mean by that? Instability without collapse.
Well, we're currently trapped in these cycles of persistent crisis, whether it's ecological disaster that's always looming, or economic bubbles that are always about to burst, or global political tension ratcheting up. We constantly feel like the apocalypse is imminent.
Yes. The end times are perpetually at hand, as if some great final reckoning is just around the corner.
And you'd think we'd be exhausted by it all, but instead we just maintain this state of sustained anxiety, always waiting for the other shoe to drop.
That's it, exactly. But the catastrophe never truly materializes. The final, clean end never arrives. We're living in the end times, meaning the world as we knew it has already structurally broken down, but the end is perpetually postponed.
So it just becomes background noise.
It becomes a sort of constant low-grade hum of existential dread. And this chronic instability, sustained without that final collapse, is the signature of the inverted world. It prevents us from ever settling into a stable reality, but it also prevents the clean slate of a total rupture.
Okay, so if the crisis isn't the real problem, but this perpetual state we're all being maintained in, then what is the fuel? What's keeping that inverted machine running? What keeps the system functioning against all rational indicators?
And that brings us right back to our key tool for this deep dive.
Decoding surplus enjoyment, or jouissance.
This is the secret operator. It's the psychological fuel that overrides our rational self-interest. Jouissance is it's a difficult concept. It's rooted in Lacanian psychoanalysis, but we can simplify it for our purposes.
Please.
It's the satisfaction you derive, not from achieving the stated rational goal, but from the act of transgression itself, or from the struggle, the obstacle, the pain.
So it's an excess of pleasure that comes with suffering.
Yes. It's non-symbolizable. You can't quite put it into words, but it's there.
We often hear about the pleasure principle, right? We seek pleasure and we avoid pain. Jouissance seems to be the dark side of that coin, where we're actively seeking the suffering because it contains this hidden satisfaction.
Think of it this way. Rational pleasure is what you seek. Jouissance is the excessive, sometimes painful satisfaction you find despite yourself.
Okay.
The common dieting analogy is actually perfect here. The rational goal is health, fitness, a good outcome. But the perverse pleasure often comes from the self-imposed restriction, the strict rules, the feeling of a virtuous struggle, or, paradoxically, the thrill of the potential violation.
The forbidden piece of cake.
The forbidden piece of cake that carries that extra kick of guilt. The enjoyment isn't in the result of the diet. It's in the ongoing process of self-denial and the tension it creates.
So we don't really want the destination.
We want the journey to remain incomplete because the struggle is where the real libidinal payoff is located.
And this hidden drive, this non-rational compulsion, you're saying this is what powers the entire global economic system.
It applies powerfully to capitalism, yes. It transforms it into what Zizek calls a pure drive.
Pure drive.
Early capitalism, it started with a rational goal to make money for comfortable consumption. But it quickly transformed into the sheer abstract pleasure of accumulation, completely divorced from any tangible utility.
So the ceaseless activity itself becomes a reward.
Precisely. The true modern capitalist. Think of a major tech CEO or a high-frequency trader. They enjoy watching the charts rise, the thrill of the transactions, the endless expansion, far more than they enjoy the actual tangible wealth they accumulate.
They're driven by this impersonal, repetitive compulsion?
For endless circular movement and expended self-reproduction, the process is the prize.
So the drive itself, the continuous expansion, becomes its own source of perverse satisfaction. It pushes beyond any logical point of rest or sufficiency. The system functions because its masters are addicted to the process of accumulation.
Absolutely. If the rational goal were just wealth for consumption, the system would eventually slow down when sufficient wealth was achieved.
But it never does.
But the jouissance of the drive ensures it can never stop. This drive, this non-rational force, is why Zizek makes this huge leap and connects the psychoanalytic concept of jouissance directly to Marx's concept of surplus value.
That does sound like a powerful theoretical jump. How does he bridge that gap?
The psychological concept of jouissance with Marx's very material analysis of capital and value. Okay, so when we look at knowledge at work, human labor, productive activity.
Yeah.
That activity inevitably secretes what we might call a libidinal entropic waste.
Entropic waste, like psychic exhaust.
Think of it like a furnace. When you burn fuel, you get the intended product heat, or in this case, economic value, but you also get smoke, ash, and wasted energy.
Okay.
That psychic ash, the measure of psychic energy that cannot be converted into work, that's the source of our surplus jouissance.
I see.
Now, capitalism attempts a kind of grand alchemical conversion. It tries to internalize and recycle this internal libidinal surplus into economic value, what Marx calls surplus value.
So it's attempting to make the waste count as profit.
Precisely. But this recycling process is doomed to fail. While capitalism tries to valorize this internal excess, the process inevitably generates an external, indigestible human surplus.
Human surplus.
A residue. This is the true structural waste of capitalist dynamics. Human beings who are excluded, marginalized, rendered meaningless by the very system that tried to eliminate internal waste.
And this is the group Lacan identified.
Drawing on Marx and Engels, he identifies this residue as the lumpen proletariat, this structurally excluded human surplus that just can't be factored into the symbolic order of value and labor.
So the system tries to eliminate waste by making it count, but in doing so, it just pushes the problem onto the social body in the form of excluded people.
It creates an indigestible human surplus. And this shift in perspective is crucial for understanding social conflict. We typically focus on visible, identifiable conflicts, but the argument here is that the real threat is the invisible stuff.
So we have to distinguish between, what, two types of violence?
Yes, between subjective violence, the visible acts carried out by identifiable agents like crime, terror, or civil unrest, and objective violence, which is systemic.
Objective violence is the dark matter of the social world.
A perfect metaphor. It's what sustains everything, but we can't see it directly.
So if subjective violence is the visible explosion, the protest, the terrorist attack, the obvious crime, then objective violence is the pressure cooker that causes the explosion. It's the unexamined baseline of our everyday life.
That's a perfect way to put it. Objective violence is invisible because it sustains the very zero-level standard against which we judge all visible subjective violence.
It's the background.
It's the background. The routine misery of precarious labor, structural racism, environmental degradation, the slow erosion of public resources. This systemic background is what generates the seemingly irrational explosions of visible subjective violence.
So we get angry about the symptom.
We often criticize the visible acts without recognizing that they are merely symptoms of the unexamined objective violence that we ourselves live within and sustain.
But if objective violence is invisible, if it sustains our perceived reality, how do we even begin to perceive it? I mean, if it's the air we breathe, we can't exactly step outside of it to analyze it.
And that's the problem. The only way to understand this systemic background is through what's called a violent methodological act.
Violent.
And here we mean methodologically violent, not necessarily physical. It's a kind of self-inflicted distress that destabilizes the way you perceive and exist in the world. It's a cognitive rupture.
That sounds almost mystical, or like a mandate for self-destruction. Why is this distress necessary?
Because it requires acting irrationally in the face of what you assume to be rational comfort. You have to strike out against your own commonly held understandings and disrupt the comfortable patterns of knowing and being that allow you to experience reality with minimal existential discomfort.
So the act itself is designed to create a rupture.
Yes. It's termed the methodological death blow to the subjective self, forcing a confrontation with the objective reality we usually screen out. You must voluntarily sacrifice the subjective self's illusion of stability to see the system that supports it.
And that system, it maintains itself by colonizing our mind.
Exactly. And the modern colonizer doesn't prohibit, it commands us to be happy.
This is the Superego injunction. Enjoy. We've completely flipped the script. The old, prohibitive, paternal superego, the authority figure who says, no, you must not do that. You must respect the law.
That's gone.
It's been replaced by this tyrannical modern injunction that just screams at you. You must enjoy. You must be happy. Fulfill your potential. Optimize everything. Live your best life.
And this command is paradoxically designed to sabotage pleasure.
How so?
Because turning enjoyment into an obligation guarantees its failure and generates profound anxiety. The more the subject tries to obey this tyrannical command, the more desperately you chase maximum pleasure and self-fulfillment, the more intensely guilty and anxious you feel.
Why?
Because the task is impossible to achieve authentically. Mandated pleasure is structurally not pleasure at all. It is a duty. And failure to perform that duty is a moral lapse.
This is perfectly demonstrated in what's called the wellness syndrome, which functions as a full-fledged modern ideology. Some people call it biomorality.
Biomorality, that's a great term for it. It's a moral obligation, not just a lifestyle choice, to maximize your health, your happiness, your subjective potential.
You see it everywhere.
Everywhere. We're constantly required to optimize every aspect of our lives, from our gut bacteria to our side hustles. Even the mundane, necessary act of washing dishes has to be reframed as mindfulness or meditation to convert it into a unit of self-optimization.
And failure is no longer just unfortunate.
It's a failure of will. It's a sign of laziness or poor self-management. Those who fail to look after their bodies, their mental health, or their financial potential are increasingly demonized as weak-willed, incompetent, or socially deviant.
So this obligation to optimize and feel good must generate immense amounts of false guilt because failure is just. It's inevitable.
It creates profound existential anxiety and guilt, yes. There's this anecdote about a woman, Sarah, an overworked office worker. She was granted 2 weeks off and meticulously planned a retreat, yoga, hiking, digital detox, all designed to maximize her happiness and recharge her batteries.
Right, to optimize her vacation.
But she returned to the office consumed by guilt. She felt like an imposter. And her guilt wasn't based on poor performance. She delivered excellent results before she left.
So what was the guilt about?
It was about her inability to manufacture the required, mandatory, authentic happiness during her time off. She felt she'd failed the impossible psychological standard of using her freedom optimally.
She wasted the opportunity to be perfectly happy.
And that failure became a source of shame.
What's so dangerous about this psychological minefield is what you call the erosion of meritocracy. If success is measured by output or some measurable achievement, that's one thing. But here, the metric itself has been displaced.
It has been displaced by an impossible psychological standard of authentic self-fulfillment. In a traditional meritocracy, you're judged on measurable output. Did you do the job? Did you produce the value?
Simple enough.
But in the modern inverted world, even if you succeed materially, you can fail ideologically if you don't feel the right way about it. The workplace, and increasingly society, becomes this psychological minefield where failure to radiate mandatory subjective wellness makes you anxious and guilty.
And that anxiety and guilt serves a vital ideological function.
It holds the entire system together by internalizing responsibility for systemic failings.
It makes us blame ourselves for not being happy enough within a fundamentally flawed system. If we can't find satisfaction, it must be because we didn't meditate hard enough, or we didn't optimize our diet enough.
Exactly. And to understand just how pathological this system of mandatory happiness is, it helps to look at a historical counterpoint, like the fragile happiness found in 1970s communist Czechoslovakia.
Okay, that's an interesting comparison.
Life there was predictable, materially secure, and often, frankly, boring. But people were, in a way, effectively happy. Their material needs were satisfied, but crucially, they were not too satisfied. The system didn't demand that they achieve their ultimate potential.
So that stability and predictability were stabilizing factors.
Yeah.
But you mentioned something even more important than just material satisfaction.
Yes, the key structural element that sustained this happiness was the external entity to blame, the party, the big other.
Right.
If anything went wrong, a shortage of coffee, a queue for gasoline, a crop failure, it was never the individual's fault. It was their fault, the fault of the faceless bureaucratic state. The individual was relieved of personal, existential responsibility for systemic failings, which reduced immense anxiety.
They had an external enemy.
An enemy onto whom they could project all their discontent and frustration.
And without that external enemy today, that blame falls entirely back onto the individual.
Precisely. We are constantly told you have the freedom to achieve everything. If you fail, it is your personal moral failure. The 1970s Czechs were spared this particular torment, but that fragile balance, that comfortable oppression was fundamentally disturbed by the force of desire. Desire compels people to move on, to confront the truth, to want something fundamentally outside the predictable symbolic order.
So desire, the very thing we usually associate with striving and progress, is actually the destructive force here.
In terms of stability.
In terms of maintaining stability, yes. This historical happiness proves that true happiness is confused and indeterminate. It relies on the subject's inability or unreadiness to fully confront the consequences of their own desire.
Okay.
Desire forces movement and confrontation with truth, and that ultimately ruins the smooth flow of daily life and stability. When we insist on chasing happiness, we are engaging in a kind of hypocrisy.
How so?
It's the happiness of dreaming about things we don't really want. If we were to actually get what we officially desire, that would be the worst possible outcome because it would shatter the illusion that the pursuit itself sustains. This brings us to what you called the most difficult Ezekian thesis, and one that really challenges our common understanding of political struggle, why we cling to the systems that make us miserable. Our rational mind tells us that once we see the lie, we should abandon it.
Right.
But the radical thesis here is that we resist truth and emancipation because we enjoy our ideology.
That is the core truth, and it's a hard one to swallow. Ideology is not merely a set of false ideas, a distortion of reality we can simply correct with true knowledge. If it were that simple, political education would solve everything.
But it doesn't.
No. Instead, ideology is the fundamental fantasy structure that allows us to find satisfaction or jouissance even in our enslavement. And the tragedy is that the moment we think we've escaped ideology, the moment we become cynically detached, that's often when we are most deeply within its grasp.
So if ideology is a fantasy structure, then we're not just being fooled by it, we're deriving a necessary perverse pleasure from the framework it provides.
Think of it as a safety blanket made of self-imposed chains. The film They Live is the perfect illustration of this.
The sunglasses.
The classic scene where Nod tries to force his friend Frank to put on the sunglasses that expose the truth of the system. The advertisement screaming, "Obey," the magazine saying, "Consume," the money revealing itself as pure status.
Frank's brutal physical resistance against the glasses is stunning. I mean, he fights Nada tooth and nail, far harder than he would fight the police. Why is that specific, localized violence so intense?
Because Frank's aggression highlights the violence of liberation. His resistance shows that putting on the glasses exposes the truth of the lie, and it shatters the illusion that he was already resisting or operating outside the system.
It takes away his comfortable cynicism.
The glasses don't just show him what is wrong, they destroy the fantasy that allowed him to cope with the reality of his enslavement. Zizek notes that we are already eating from the trash can all the time, but the material force of ideology makes us not see what we're eating.
Frank resists because he's being forced to endure the extreme violence of liberation.
A trauma that strips away the fantasy, leaving him naked before the meaningless real.
So our fantasies are protective gear against the real, against the meaningless trauma of social antagonism.
Exactly. Our fantasies are these illusions of subjective wholeness that cover up the irreducible trauma of social antagonism. They prevent the subject from realizing the void, the lack, at the core of their being. We require these symbolic fictions, these stories we tell ourselves about who we are and how the world works, to structure our identities and provide a minimal sense of meaning.
And the most important framework that provides that structure is what we call the big other.
The big other is the symbolic network. It's the totality of unwritten social rules, cultural discourse, and shared assumptions that forms our intersubjective network, constitutive of all meaning and reality.
It's the external system we define ourselves against.
Yes, but here is the core paradox. The big other is a social fiction. It does not exist as a coherent, consistent entity. There's no final authority holding the whole system together.
But we have to act like there is.
We must presuppose it for minimum social order and meaning. We cannot operate without the belief that the rules are generally followed and generally make sense.
So we know intellectually that the big other is empty, but we have to behave as if it is absolutely real, or society just collapses into chaos. We are trapped by a necessary fiction.
We are trapped because we cannot navigate our own self-inconsistency, the fact that we are split subjects, without referencing this external system. Even as we attempt to let go of the symbolics, we find new layers of our self-identity that we're unable to navigate without referencing it. And it's this essential fiction that allows us to find comfort in consumerism.
Okay, tell us more about that. How does this entanglement with fiction relate to the commodity fetish and our engagement with consumerism?
Well, even in our cynical, enlightened times, when we see through the system, when we know that a commodity is just an ordinary object embodying reified social relations produced through exploitation.
We know the new iPhone isn't magic.
Right. And yet it still appears to us as an uncanny, magical object. It still controls us. Knowledge itself is not enough to break the spell. The new iPhone isn't just a phone. It's a piece of magic that promises a certain kind of fulfillment. And that promise holds its power regardless of whether we know about the labor conditions in Shenzhen.
This suggests that our cynicism is just another layer of the ideology. It allows us to participate while feeling morally superior to it.
And that is where the power of belief by proxy comes in. Ideology works by displacing our belief onto the commodity itself, or onto the system, allowing us to maintain our cynical distance while the system thrives.
Can you explain that with a classic example?
The canned laughter on a sitcom. When you watch a show with a laugh track, you know it's fake. You maintain a cynical distance. You say, I don't need this show to tell me what's funny. I know that's artificial. But the TV set, the commodity, the ideological apparatus, it's doing the believing for you. By incorporating the fake laughter, it relieves us of the need to consciously identify with the system. It allows us to enjoy and relax, thereby preparing us for more work the next day.
We've outsourced our emotional and ideological labor.
Exactly. The commodity, by enjoying the joke for us, has hooked us at the level of surplus jouissance, maintaining the ideological illusion without requiring our explicit conscious belief.
And this process of outsourcing belief and constantly feeling inadequate to the big other, this must affect our very sense of self, our subjective consistency.
It creates what Lacan terms the barred subject, which is represented by the symbol. The subjective self is pathologically barred beneath the mandates of the symbolic. If I were to ask you, just in simple terms, what does it feel like to be the barred subject?
It sounds like the feeling of always failing to live up to the image of yourself that society has set for you. The feeling that I should be better, or I should be happier, or I should fit into this role perfectly, even though the role itself is structurally impossible to fulfill.
Precisely. Our perceived ontological consistency, that feeling that we are a coherent, stable self, is, in actuality, an unconscious misrecognition of the discursive subjugation necessary for the system to operate.
So our sense of self is a mistake.
It's an illusionary consistency. It's the context through which we falsely attain recognition, yet simultaneously become complicit in our own alienation. We are always feeling to fulfill an imagined identity. We are a nothingness counted as something. Our entire existence is premised on this lack, this failure to absolutely fit. And this perpetual gap between who we are and the self demanded by this symbolic order generates chronic anxiety, which again is recycled as energy for the inverted world.
We've established that the system is fueled by our perverse enjoyment and that we cling to our ideological fantasy. Now, let's apply this key to contemporary political fragmentation and activism. You suggest that much of what looks like political activity might actually be driven by surplus enjoyment, creating motion without progress.
When analyzing certain political movements, especially those characterized by fervent, immediate mobilization and a lot of internal policing, you cannot ignore the existence of a collective surplus enjoyment that's derived from a carnival atmosphere.
The carnival.
A carnival is a temporary suspension of norms where the usual prohibitions are lifted.
And in a political context, this isn't necessarily a physical party, but more of a psychological space.
It translates to the shared thrill of transgression, saying what shouldn't be said, breaking social conventions, or performing moral outrage at an elevated volume. The collective jouissance of the carnival is the emotional high derived from boundary breaking.
And that unites the group.
It unites the group in a way that goes far beyond any rational policy platform. It's the sheer enjoyment of the fight, the collective moral righteousness.
This dynamic seems acutely relevant when looking at contemporary activism, particularly the elements that are often labeled as woke culture movements.
Absolutely. The performance of moral outrage and the constant policing of language, this pseudo-activity, it generates a perverse satisfaction. The risk of being canceled or the thrill of canceling others functions as a very strict, albeit murky, form of the big other.
Murky how?
The criteria for what is acceptable are never fully articulated, which makes the system of judgment pervasive and anxiety-inducing. The goal of moral purity is impossible, which is what makes the chase so compellingly self-perpetuating.
It's the anxiety of not knowing the exact rule, only the constant threat of violation that forces conformity in public performance.
The criteria are murky by design. That is what makes it so controlling. We see this pathology clearly in the anecdote of Elias, the activist who mobilized his network to shut down a small family-owned bakery over outdated, non-inclusive language used on a decades-old menu board.
Okay.
His ostensible goal was justice, to reform the community. But what he actually experienced was a vibrating thrill during the campaign. He felt connected, righteous, purposeful.
And what happened when the campaign succeeded, when the bakery closed?
He didn't feel the peace of justice achieved. Instead, he felt a hollow crash, a profound withdrawal symptom. He was immediately scrolling for the next target, feeling the urgent need to mobilize against a new, often internal enemy.
So the perverse satisfaction of the fight became the engine.
It became the true product. It ensures perpetual conflict, even in the absence of a large-scale systemic enemy. The political output became secondary to the libidinal payoff of the outrage cycle.
And this tendency contributes to a fundamental paralysis, particularly on the political left, where so much energy is consumed by these internal battles.
Precisely. Activists engage in a frenetic output of pseudo-activity rhetoric, identity politics, endless internal policing, often against their own allies, to avoid public shaming and the label of being one of them or reactionary.
And the result?
The result is that they become stuck in a ditch. They're spinning their wheels furiously in motion, but achieving rhetorical output rather than real systemic change. They're so busy fighting the internal enemy and enjoying the outrage, the jouissance of moral purification, that they lose the ability to devise a project capable of commanding an enthusiastic popular response for genuine systemic restructuring.
That obsessive focus on the internal system and the surface activity, it requires us to look not just at what we are doing, but at how we are being seen. Which brings us back to the psychological concept of the gaze.
Right, we have to introduce the Lacanian gaze to unhinge our perception. We are accustomed to believing that the look belongs to the subject, the one doing the looking.
I look at something.
But the gaze, paradoxically, belongs to the object. We are constantly looked at from all sides by the world itself, and the object is always gazing back from a point the subject cannot see.
That's a profound thought. That when I look at a screen or a landscape, the screen or the landscape is looking back at me from a position I can never fully occupy.
Correct. The gaze is that point of opacity, the flaw in the visual field that reminds us we are always perceived, always placed within a structure that precedes us. The subject is the pathological stain from which they are able to perceive themselves against the chaos of their own misrecognition.
The pathological stain.
And recognizing ourselves as this stain, this fundamental imperfection in the symbolic order, is what transforms a narcissistic reflexivity into an ethical act of collective enunciation. It involves accepting that my self-identity is defined by its failures and inconsistencies.
And what is the consequence when we encounter this gaze in its purest, most unsettling form?
When we encounter the other qua the real, which Zizek sometimes terms the inhuman partner, we experience a confrontation with something with whom no symmetrical dialogue can be mediated by the symbolic order.
So no common ground.
None. This experience exposes the vortices, the gaps, and the voids in the fabric of reality that threaten our symbolic structure.
Can you give us an example of this uncanny other? What would that look like?
It's the encounter with pure contingency, something absolutely senseless. A sudden, gratuitous act of violence, or a natural disaster that utterly defies rational explanation or integration into our narratives of meaning.
Right.
The realization of the real is traumatic because it indicates the incompleteness of the symbolic. Every ideology, every discourse contains a point it cannot account for, a void it cannot symbolize, and that is where the real ruptures our understanding. And this is why we cling so desperately to the fictions of the big other, to avoid confronting that void.
So if the inverted world is sustained by our enjoyment of our own enslavement and our fantasy structure, then simply seeing the truth isn't enough.
No. Intellectual enlightenment does not break the ideological chains.
We have to find a way out of the matrix of our own making. And that, you say, requires violence against the self.
Which brings us to Zizek's most radical proposal, traversing the fantasy through subjective destitution.
For the rationalists stuck in the inverted world, this sounds like a terrifying abandonment of sanity itself. What exactly does this traumatic step entail?
Subjective destitution is the proposed radical exit. It is the complete abandonment of one's self-identity, one's status, and one's phantasmatic understanding of reality. It is a necessary, albeit painful and deeply traumatic, act of letting go of the self that the symbolic order, the social system, has given you.
So you have to accept the lack.
You have to accept the fundamental lack at the core of your being, realizing that the self you thought you were was merely a function of the system.
It sounds like shedding the skin that allows you to function socially. You're voluntarily stepping outside the symbolic order, which means losing all meaning and recognition.
That is the voluntary loss. And we have a powerful illustration of this path in the anecdote of Dr. Eris, the tenured professor. He was trapped, constantly adjusting his language, performing moral alignment, and apologizing to navigate the treacherous ideological minefield of his university.
So his status was high, but his subjective freedom was zero.
He had everything the system could offer, security, prestige, intellectual freedom, but felt completely muffled.
So what did he do?
By voluntarily letting go of his tenure and his status, his entire symbolic identity, he forced himself into that moment of destitution. By accepting being a nobody, stripped of the recognition and identity the institution gave him, he was finally able to speak plainly and act without fear of ideological retribution.
He endured the psychological violence of liberation.
And in that space of total loss, he reclaimed a foundation for common sense, one no longer dependent on the approval of the big other. His voluntary loss was an intervention against the discursive, symbolic structure.
So this isn't just quitting a job. This is a philosophical, a structural death.
It is described in Hegelian terms as the night of the world. This is not merely depression or a personal crisis. This is where the entire symbolic texture of reality disintegrates, and the subject encounters the active nothingness that preceded their being.
Okay.
For Hegel and for Zizek, the human being becomes the night, the empty nothingness that contains everything in its simplicity. The symbolic subjectivity you once possessed must be completely reinvented from nothing, from that void. It is the ultimate cognitive trauma.
But if the rationalist endures this existential loss, traverses the fantasy, and recognizes that the big other does not exist, they're facing the abyss. That seems to lead straight to nihilism or deep cynicism. If there's no external guarantee for meaning, why bother doing anything?
That is the core difficulty, and that is why Zizek demands the courage of hopelessness.
The courage of hopelessness.
True courage is not imagining a clear alternative. The light at the end of the tunnel is likely the headlights of an oncoming train. The dream of a comfortable, prepackaged alternative is theoretical cowardice. We have to accept the consequences of the fact that there is no clearly discernible, guaranteed alternative, and that our efforts may fail catastrophically.
So, if we strip away the fantasy and realize the void, how do we avoid that cynical withdrawal, the stance of just refusing to participate because the system is all fiction?
After traversing the fantasy and realizing that the big other does not exist, the only ethical way to avoid cynical withdrawal, like the demigod Loge who refuses to enter Valhalla in Wagner's Rheingold because he sees its inherent doom,
Right.
is to heroically assume the position of a new master. This is the necessity of the new master.
That seems entirely contradictory. You reject the authority of the symbolic only to assert a new authority. Why must the destitution lead to a new form of mastery?
Because this master must assume authority, despite knowing its fictionality and lack of real fundament. They have to act with full sincerity and risk, embodying the Kantian imperative. Du kannst, denn du sollst. You can because you must.
So, I know I'm too weak to do it, and I know there is no external guarantee for its truth, but I'll do it nonetheless.
Yes. The gods entering Valhalla, knowing their eventual doom but performing the ceremonial act with heroic dignity, they exemplify this radical, sincere performance. We must assume the risk of imposing a better fiction, a new system of meaning by elevating an ordinary object or idea to the status of the thing, the absolute foundation for a new common sense.
The new common sense then isn't discovered, it is violently imposed onto the void.
Exactly. And the force required to create this new symbolic order is not derived from gentle persuasion or liberal tolerance. The radical act requires Paulinian love, agape, which is defined as a violent, passionate act.
This is not sentimental love.
Not at all. It is a brutal, necessary force. Love must be linked to cruelty to transcend natural human limitations. This revolutionary love introduces radical difference into the symbolic, privileging the excluded, other, the lumpen proletariat, the structurally excluded, who were invisible to the old order. It is the domain of pure violence outside the law, the ultimate gesture of commitment to a new ethical foundation, a foundation built upon the courage of accepting its own fictionality. So we have completed the deep dive into the inverted world, and we've seen that the frustration, the obstacle, and the struggle are often not roadblocks to happiness, but the very things fueling our existence, thanks to the perverse drive of surplus enjoyment. The modern tyranny is not prohibition, but the impossible, anxiety-inducing demand to enjoy, which creates the very guilt and self-blame that holds the ideological system together.
This analysis reveals that cynical detachment, the stance of, I know the system is fake so I won't participate, is not an exit. It is a luxury conferred by the system itself. The only path forward, according to this radical philosophical framework, is the traumatic, violent act of subjective destitution shedding the self the world has given you. This process culminates not in passive self-aware knowledge, but in the heroic, necessary commitment to building a new foundation for common sense, fully embracing the lack of any external guarantee for its truth or success.
We leave you with the realization that the core of our freedom lies in the capacity to impose order and meaning onto the abyssal chaos, an endeavor we must pursue with unwavering dedication, even as we know the structure supporting us is, at its deepest core, self-referential fiction.